Okay. Let's get started. Lots of people are filtering in, so we'll just make a start. Hello, everyone, and warm welcome to our session, Voices at Risk, Journalist Safety During the Super Election Year. This is a collaboration between Media Defence and the International Women's Media Foundation. Welcome to everyone logging in from all over the world. My name is Anushka Shelikins, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at Media Defence. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, Media Defence's core mission is to provide legal help to journalists and independent media under threat for their reporting. Over the last 15 years, we have provided legal support to thousands of journalists across 117 countries through our emergency defense and strategic litigation work, protecting freedom of expression and journalists' rights globally. Our co-host for this panel, the International Women's Media Foundation, is a global organization built to serve the holistic needs of women and non-binary journalists. Their work strengthens equal opportunity and press freedom worldwide. Through the work of both of our organizations, we are all too aware of the increased threats that journalists face during important political moments and understand the critical role that they play in ensuring fair elections. This year, 2.6 billion voters will go to the polls in more than 50 countries. Journalists are on the front lines, providing us with the vital information we need to elect our leaders. However, in a world fraught with polarization, mis- and disinformation, they are facing severely increased threats, including arbitrary arrests, smear campaigns, and physical assault. UNESCO recently reported that between 2019 and 2022 alone, 759 media workers across 70 countries were attacked during election reporting, with nearly half of these attacks by law enforcement agents. We have already seen these crackdowns in countries with elections scheduled for this year, including in Senegal and in India. In addition to physical violence, reporters are encountering heightened threats online and legal assaults. Governments are increasingly utilizing internet shutdowns and digital surveillance as tools to censor journalists under the guise of national security. Within the first 2 months of 2024, the internet has already been deliberately blocked by 5 states with upcoming elections. Moreover, gender disinformation is increasingly being employed as a weapon against women journalists and non-binary journalists, particularly during these election periods. This is why discussions such as these are so important. In the super election year, it is essential that we intensify our efforts and galvanize collective strategies to protect journalists' safety and uphold the rights of freedom of expression and access to information. Over the next hour, we will have the opportunity to hear directly from journalists who confront these threats firsthand, as well as from the organizations dedicated to fostering an environment in which media workers can freely and safely report. Now, to speak about the threats to freedom of expression and safety of journalists during elections, we couldn't have wished for a better panelists. First, we have the co-organizer of today's session, Nadine Hoffman. Nadine is IWMF's Deputy Executive Director and is responsible for developing the organization's programmatic priorities and initiatives. Since joining the IWMF in 2010, Nadine has spearheaded the organization's expanding safety work. As an expert in journalist safety, Nadine understands the unique challenges gender diverse journalists experience. Next, we have Prasanth Sugathan. Prasanth is an experienced lawyer and the legal director of Software Freedom Law Centre, an NGO promoting open knowledge, free speech, and online privacy in India. He has also been an expert panelist at various national and international conferences on freedom of speech, privacy, net neutrality, and cybersecurity. Then on my virtual left, we have Papa Ismaila Dieng, a journalist and advocacy officer at AfricTivistes, Senegal. AfricTivistes is a pan-African organization based in Senegal who promote and defend democratic values, human rights, and good governance through digital platforms. And then last, but certainly not least, there is Numi Pineda. Numi is a researcher at Article 19 Mexico and Central America for their Journalist Protection and Defense Program. At the end of our session, there will be some time for questions and for participants to share their perspectives. Feel free to send those through the chat throughout the webinar or do so at the end. We will also be sharing some resources throughout the webinar in the chat, so do keep an eye out and feel free to share resources that you find are useful on this topic as well. Now, with no further ado, I would like to hand it over to Nadine Hoffman.
Good morning. Thank you for this panel and for this opportunity to partner with Media Defense. We love working with you, and so it's great to be here today with all of you. So just to sort of set the scene, I think we can all agree on this webinar that we cannot really have democracy without a free press, but an essential element of having a free press is the ability of journalists to work safely wherever they are. And so we've seen, as you've just said, Anushka, quite a number of threats and a rise of threats that are affecting journalists globally in all of the countries you'll hear from today. But I think really we should be cognizant that we're seeing a global trend that is tied to the rise of populist and authoritarian governments. We're also seeing just a general decline of the state of free expression in a number of country contexts. And we're also witnessing a rise of misogyny globally, which I would say ties in directly to the ability to have a truly free press. So the International Women's Media Foundation, as you've heard, is dedicated to advancing women and non-binary journalists globally. And one of the key strategies that we employ to do that is through trying to ensure the protection of all journalists to be able to have their voices heard, especially in an important time of elections. We're also very focused on trying to build a culture of safety in newsrooms and across the news media globally, because we think that is critical for our journalists to be able to actually effectively do their work. So we do provide, as an organization, safety training across the globe with a specific focus on women and non-binary journalists, but we do serve all genders. And this year specifically, with so many elections happening, we have been doing programming across the United States and across Mexico, particularly to try to support journalists who are really in the bullseye, as you may say. And I wanted to talk about some of the threats that we're seeing in the field, but also some of the top tips and strategies that we're focusing on in our training that we feel can support, help to prevent and mitigate some of those threats. You know, we are seeing threats that range from armed groups, and now I'm speaking about our work, particularly in the US and in Mexico, to doxing. We've seen just recently the example of AMLO in Mexico doxing the New York Times bureau reporter in Mexico City. So we know that the threats are both physical and digital and also psychological. And I'll talk about how we can mitigate those three areas in just a moment. We're focused really on reaching this year, particularly the needs of local journalists and freelance journalists, small newsrooms that may not have the resources to put in place robust security protocols, either because of budget or just a lack of knowledge. And particularly, we're looking at the newsroom's duty of care to protect their people, to be able to tell these really critical stories and to hold governments to account. I want to acknowledge that in many cases, in some of the country contexts we'll hear from today, that mitigating the risks of covering elections means that reporters have to take extreme measures that really impact their daily lives. And even then, their lives might be in danger. They may have to change their pattern of life, their everyday routine, learn how to spot surveillance, and they have to learn how to counter that surveillance if they are being surveilled. Maybe changing the car that they drive, locking down their social media, and even maybe temporary relocation when they receive threats. So just to acknowledge the sort of gravity of the situation, that people are taking risks to their lives to be able to bring us important information that we must have as citizens of these democracies going into election years. So when we go in to train journalists, and we've just come back from training a number of local journalists across the state of Georgia in the United States, where, as you may have heard, there are many threats both to the democratic process and to the reporters trying to cover that. We start with talking about how to assess risk and how to assess and mitigate that risk. We're encouraging journalists and their editors to really focus on advanced planning before going out in the field, whether or not it seems like the story might lead to some sort of danger, just to be able to get into the practice of looking at who might want to hurt me, what am I trying to protect, and what are some simple strategies I can put in place before I get to the situation to try to prevent the worst from happening. So we're encouraging journalists to be thinking, of course, first and foremost about their physical safety, what kind of PPE or personal protective equipment they may need in a situation. And so, for example, in a situation where you're covering a protest or a political rally where it's possible to see civil unrest, we would be advising journalists to be carrying with them things like goggles, an N95 mask, or even a more serious full face mask to protect them from tear gas, from foam bullets. We may want to recommend a bike helmet to protect from blunt trauma. In the United States specifically, we know that police do use tear gas, and we know that there is a lot of gun violence, and sometimes that can happen at a rally. So focusing on what is the plan to escape if you are in a protest that turns violent, and how will you get away? So we want people to really be thinking in advance of going into the situation, what are my escape routes? How am I going to get the story without exposing myself to direct risk? And also, who can be an ally for me in that situation if things start to go bad. So we always recommend that journalists are working with someone else, not alone. And if that can't be someone from the newsroom, how can they find allies in whatever situation they're going into? Can that be another reporter, even if it's not from your own news outlet, if you're an independent journalist, for example? We really need to focus on building our communities and networks of support, particularly in times of danger. In terms of the digital safety that we're looking at, obviously we want to protect our data and our personal information and our sources, which is also something that it becomes increasingly important in an election year. So we're encouraging journalists to look at their digital hygiene in advance of covering a sensitive story, publishing something that may lead to backlash. We want to make sure we're locking down our devices, that we're cleaning up the data that exists about us online that could be used to harm us, both from a reputational standpoint, or that could be used to dox us, as we have seen in many instances where journalists' personal information, including their addresses, their phone numbers, may be leaked publicly, allowing then the possibility for physical harm. So that is something we definitely want to protect. One recommendation we always give is for journalists to actually dox themselves. So going online and searching for what is publicly available about you, including images that are available about you. Also really trying to separate out your personal information and social media presence from your professional and journalistic presence, so that what you're posting about your kids, maybe your family life, that is not something that we want the general public to be able to see. Those settings should be locked down. The other piece that I really want to focus on today is the psychological safety. And I think that conversation has started to happen in our profession with newsrooms in the last few years, much more openly. But the reality is that we cannot do these important jobs and do our journalistic work if we don't take care of ourselves and our mental health. We know that election times are extremely stressful and can lead to burnout, particularly for small newsrooms, independent journalists who are working without much of a safety net, who are covering really difficult stories and taking these great risks that I've talked about. So we really want to focus on how to create self-care plans and support networks so that as we're going through these situations, we are able to be resilient and withstand the extreme stress and trauma that comes with this work of journalism in dangerous contexts. So this is something in our training we do focus on really as part of the core elements of making your safety plan is how you're going to take care of your mental health, who's going to support you, who's going to have your back, and when you're really struggling, that you're able to get some resources and help that you need. So I hope we can also have a bigger conversation about that psychological support today. I've been talking a little bit about allies, and one of the things that we've seen going out into local communities and working with journalists is how important it is to be able to have a cohort of support, whether that's within your own newsroom or for freelancers, because we know many journalists are freelancers, with like-minded peers who can help us to actually survive and get through these difficult times. It's also important, I think, for journalists all over the world to know what organizations are available to support them, both in their countries. So we'll hear, I think, from some excellent examples of in-country resources today on this call. Whether that's a network of journalists, a union, whether it's a regional assistance network, or whether it's international organizations like Media Defense, the IWMF, CPJ, international media support, and many more that do offer emergency assistance for journalists in distress, who can advocate for journalists who have been detained or arrested. And that is something that you should know, the help available to you before you're in a situation to need it. So definitely we want to encourage everybody who's on this call, whatever your role is as a journalist or an editor in a newsroom, to just start proactively having these safety conversations, to be making a plan, to be preparing for the various scenarios that we know can arise, especially in an election year, so that we're not trying to fix it after something really bad has happened. And we know how we can be safer in our work so that we can bring vital information to the communities that we serve. I look forward to the discussion and to hearing from our colleagues. I'll pause there.
Hi, Nadine. Thank you so much for that really insightful discussion. The training resources and recommendations that you provide are really invaluable to journalists. And we've linked some of those in the chat as well for anyone who is interested in looking at those further. I'd like to now pass to Prasanth Sugathan to speak about the country context in India. And as Nadine mentioned, we'll now look at some more kind of local strategies and resources that are available. Thank you.
Thanks. Am I audible? Okay. Yeah. So first of all, thanks to Media Defense and IWMF for inviting us to be part of this event. As indeed, 2024 is definitely a major year for democracy. Journalists, of course, have a large role to play to ensure that these elections are free and fair. However, when it comes to India, where almost the entire mainstream media and TV channels acting like government mouthpieces. We now hardly know the difference between the government PR wing, the public relations wing, and the media. So that is a sad reality that we are facing in India now. Of course, the light at the end of the tunnel, I mean, rather bleak, dark tunnel, I would say, is the independent media and independent journalists. However, they often have to face the might of the government machinery. I'll start with one instance where what you're seeing on the screen right now, these are two media outlets, one, The Wire, which reported it, and The Caravan, again, an independent media outlet, which The Wire is an online media, and Caravan both publishes online and offline. So this was a report by The Caravan recently. This was mostly about an operation by the army, by the military in the Kashmir region. And this was printed in their magazine. And there was also an online story about it. And they receive a takedown order from the Ministry of Information Broadcasting. The provision used is Section 69A of the IT Act and Rule 16 of the Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code, Rules 2021. In fact, we on the part of Software Freedom Law Center, we have challenged these rules, the IT Rules 2021. And the matter is now pending before the Supreme Court. But what happened is, see, one problem with those rules is that there's also a confidentiality provision. So the moment you get a takedown order, there's not much that you can do. Even if it's a news outlet, they cannot release the order. Since there is a confidentiality clause and you're not supposed to release the order or share it with anybody else. So they got this takedown order and they had to, the problem was that the government told them that if you don't take down this article, your entire website will be shut down. So the news outlet was forced to take down the article and the video in question. And then this was reported widely by media, and there was even the Journalist Association, the Press Council. They came out with let's say a letter in support of the Caravan, and especially mainly I would say the independent media was very supportive of them, and the Caravan has said that they will be now challenging this before the court of law. But I mean, we don't know till now. The article is not online. We don't know like what would happen in court. But that is the problem, is that this is now a kind of a pattern that we are seeing. Any news which is critical of the government, any protest that is happening, it is often met with this, especially if it is online, it is met with force by the government so that there is no news, especially since the elections are very near. We could have the elections like 2 months time, 2 to 3 months time. That's the kind of time frame that we have now. And we are sure that we'll be seeing more of this happening in the future. And that is what is really troubling. In fact, you should read along with this the Pegasus revelations which happened, where journalists, politicians, and human rights defenders were targeted. The matter is now still pending before the Supreme Court, and we are also, let's say, appearing in a matter for a journalist in this case. So it is a mix of content takedowns, then a case of surveillance, and also criminal actions in many cases where cases are registered, FIRs are registered against journalists for doing their job. It's their job to report. And the unfortunate part of this is we hardly have any journalists who are now questioning the government. It's essentially, as I said, a few independent media houses, a few independent journalists who are going to question the government. It's the so-called mainstream media, the TV channels. You only see reports about the government, praising the government of the great work that they've done for the last 10 years. So that's the sad state of affairs right now. Recently, we had the farmers' protest in India. I mean, it's not just in India. We have seen it. We are seeing it in other parts of the world too these days. But this was the farmers' protest still happening. Farmers were marching to the national capital of New Delhi, pressing for a number of demands, including a minimum selling price for their crops. But they were faced with, I would say, there were like roadblocks across the road. It was like a warlike situation in the borders of the national capital region, where let's say we enter the capital region from the other states, mostly states like Punjab, Haryana, and the Uttar Pradesh. And along with it came the blocking of handles on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, all the, let's say, social media handles which were being used by the various organizations to send the messages across and to make sure that people know about why this is happening. And also, there were internet shutdowns across the various regions. Now, the problem with this is these were like a few of the handles which are blocked. The problem was that this is not in response to an incident which has happened. This is more like pre-censorship. You don't even, these handles haven't even posted anything. See, the protests were about to happen, and the handles of persons who the government thought were associated with these groups, with the farmers groups who were protesting, these handles were blocked. And here the difference is it's the entire handles which are blocked, not just the content. Twitter came out with a response saying that they don't agree with it, but then there's not much that they can do about it, and they need to, let's say, go by what the government tells them. Because they had earlier opposed a few of such content takedowns in the High Court, and unfortunately, the first judgment was not in their favor, and they have gone in appeal against that judgment. But so this is what Twitter did. And again, in many of these cases, these handles, the users are not often told about why these handles are getting blocked. These orders are just sent to the intermediaries, the platforms, asking the handles to be taken down. And they are left with no chance even to question it before a court of law because they don't even know why the handles are taken down. And as I said, this is more like a preemptive measure. So that, again, is a problem. Here again, the enabling law is something called the Section 69A of the Information Technology Act and the rules, the 2009 rules. Again, Rule 16 is a rule used in the case of emergency blocking. That was used in the case of caravan. These rules are again challenged, and the matter is still pending before the Supreme Court. Now, along with the blocking, as I said, internet shutdowns were also imposed in various regions. And these also were preemptive shutdowns. There was no law and order situation. There were no unrest happening. There was just these peaceful protests, which were planned across various states, and farmers marched into the national capital region. And internet can be shut down only on two things. That's if there's a public emergency or for public safety. But in this case, these were preemptive shutdowns. The reason given was there could be some law and order situation happening, and to prevent that, internet is being shut down. But we had the Software and Law Center. We have a tracker which tracks shutdowns which have been happening in the country right from 2012. And the sad fact is that, when it comes to shutdowns, we are number one up there. Unfortunately, when it comes to press freedom, we are 161 out of 180 countries. But when it comes to internet shutdowns, we are number one up there. So that shows definitely that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, especially when it comes to an election. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Apologies, my screen froze there, so I didn't realize that you'd finished. Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I think one of the key takeaways is this worrying trend of pre-censorship of accounts and preemptive internet shutdowns. It's a really worrying thing that seems to be happening. We'll turn now to Papa Ismaila, who will be speaking about the shutdowns in Senegal as well. So it will be interesting to see whether there are any parallels between the two countries and what could be done. I'll turn to you now.
Thank you, Anushka. Good morning, everybody. My name is Papa Ismaila Dieng. I'm from Senegal. Sorry, but my English will not be as good as yours. I'm French-speaking native. English is not my native language. So in Senegal, we are in a very important electoral year. As you may know, we should have been electing our president last Sunday, but the election has been postponed, and we don't know when it will take place. We are waiting for the Constitutional Court to decide, the Constitutional Council, sorry. Now talking about the journalists in Senegal and the problem we have about the security and how people are in danger. The first problem we have, and the first thing, is inside the corporation, I would say. You have the cases like where journalists are sent to the field, like to track down a candidate, and their media, their organization doesn't allow them the means to do their works. So they are often forced now to rely on the means set up by the candidates, and they have to follow. And this affects first the way they process information, and because they are obliged to say things in a certain way not to be thrown off the burst, and this puts them at risk. In the last presidential election in 2019, a candidate's delegation has been attacked by some opponents, and the attackers targeted the bus in which journalists were. And we had some of our colleagues who had been to the hospital for that. That's the first problem we have. We have the case also, as someone said it, the danger is also physical and online. We have the case where some journalists, because of some articles they wrote, have their personal data to be disclosed, such as their addresses, their telephone numbers, their family, their old pictures, for example, or people trying to disclose some information they have on them. That's also a danger we have. And we have the, let's say, national police forces violence. 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a protest in Dakar, and we had one of our colleague journalists, a woman named Absa Ann, which has been attacked by police. Some other colleagues recorded the scenes. They put it on social media, and the government say this has never existed. The Ministry of Justice have a press conference in which they say we have never seen a journalist attacked by the police forces. And in the same way, in the same day, there we see another. We saw another video on which we not to publish a video he recorded, an information he had. They did not brutalize him. They did not arrest him. They were just talking him gently. You may ask what was the difference between the first one they brutalized and beat in the street and the other one. The only difference was the first one is a Senegalese journalist, the other one is a French journalist. They had different, let's say, behavior between whether they are talking with a Senegalese journalist. In that moment, the first answer they have is violence, and whether they are talking to like a foreign journalist. In that situation, they are very gentle. They can discuss. They can say. They can ask questions. They can even sometimes help him and secure him. These are the main problem we have. Now we have the online let's say the online danger has you have, for example, when you tweet something or when you put groups with where they are with their friends, like this one, and you have like 1 to 3 days where you are attacked. Like less than a week ago now, I've been attacked myself on social media when people were trying to find my older tweets, my old tweets like from 2, 3 years or 4 years ago, and trying to show that I was lying on something or I'm against their candidates or I'm against their political leaders. That's the big problem we have. And now we have a new problem in Senegal. It's the problem of press cards. We had a new media code, new laws about media that had been voted in 2017. And this media say now journalists have to have the national press card. And we've seen we have at least 3 journalists who had been sent to jail because the government say they were illegally doing the journalist work because they don't have the press cards. And those people are in the media, are journalists from now more than 10 years. So it's the government had a weapon now on us. Like me, for example, I've stopped writing on some papers or on some official presentation journalists because I'm waiting for my press card to be delivered. It hasn't been delivered yet. So I cannot do my journalist work as I want. I cannot go somewhere. Like there was a national dialogue on Monday and Tuesday. I couldn't go there. So I had to work from distance and try to cover the things, because if I go there without a press card, I can be arrested for doing a journalist work. It's like now we are the same as someone who is practicing medicine without being a doctor or without having been to a or practicing as a lawyer without having been in a, let's say, in a law university. That's the main problem we are having. And I would say that if I divide the sources of the problem, we have 3 parts. We have mainly the first threats come from the government, how they use the laws, how they use the police force, and how they defend the police forces when they behave wrong. The part is from his job, so he has to realize on that or by someone else. They do not protect him like legally because the journalist is not really trained to know what he can do legally or not. And when sometimes he had been sent in jails, even the media organization do not provide a lawyer for him. And the third problem comes from the political parties and their let's say and their militants. Let's say I will use the French word, who are like we have I don't know people working on the biases, but there is people are really on what we can call the confirmation biases. If what you say is okay, with what you say because it's okay for my candidates or for my political leader, it's true. if it's not okay for him, it's false. And when they think it's false, you can be attacked physically. I myself can receive like so many messages sometimes saying, be careful, do not go out at night because I hear that people are preparing something for you, or do not go to this or that place because someone can attack you there. Sometimes I receive messages saying that, okay, the police they're trying to find a way to arrest you. They are looking on what you wrote on social media, on what you wrote, and what you were writing in your articles or something. It's been years now because I cannot practice journalist legally in Senegal because I do not have yet my press card. I have to write articles for some international media, but not for Senegalese media, to protect myself from being sent to jail for doing the media work. And so I'll be stopping there and waiting maybe for the question and answers. If people want to know more about Senegal, I have also some documents I can share with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Papa Ismaila, for that really interesting presentation. Thank you for sharing your personal experience as well. I think it's so important to hear from journalists who are working on the ground about the different issues that they face, and for touching on the racial intersections. I think it's so important to understand these threats that journalists face with those types of intersections and from different lenses, to understand how we can better help and support. Additionally, seeing that threats are becoming more complex is something that we've seen globally, and the fact that you now need a press card, governments are becoming more creative in the ways that they choose to silence journalists and the methods that they employ. So again, really interesting discussion. That takes us on now to our final panelist, Numi Pineda, to elaborate on the situation for journalists in Mexico and Central America and the threats that you're facing there.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone following us here. Thank you also for giving me the time to talk to you and to share some of the contexts where we find commonalities that help us build a minimum support network to improve. In terms of security, under Article 19, in Mexico and Central America, we have been monitoring attacks on the press and on everyone trying to express themselves freely. In 2003, just to give you some context, there were 561 attacks against journalists and media, and that means that in Mexico, one journalist is attacked every 16 hours. This is very concerning because outside of Israel or the occupied territories in Palestine, our country remains as one of the most lethal for anyone practicing journalism. The main attacks and violence are harassment, the illegitimate use of public power, stigmatization that is performed in public spaces from people with in public office. It's very important to mention this because the state of Mexico, the government, is still the main aggressor against the press. Federally and at state and local level in our municipalities, it is mainly attacks against the press and the media by government members. And I have to mention also organized crime groups that also are attacking the press in Mexico. The press is right at the forefront with their interests, and so there's also an issue there. Political parties are also getting into this trend, becoming more aggressive, and also because of the elections context we have in the country that has been heightened. We know that worldwide there are many elections periods going on. Mexico is also about to have a historical election that would not be presented necessarily before. It just started on July 2nd. We will have more than 3,000 different offices being elected. and citizens will be voting for this. And in response to this context and the electoral process that is coming up, the strategy in Mexico to monitor all these aggressions and try to enhance security and safety, we have an initiative that began in 2013 in the context of public protests and repression by the state. And it was just a matter of protecting those who were protecting or manifesting themselves, and also against any arbitrary measures taken by the authorities and elements of public safety. In 2013, we created a network called Rompe el Miedo, Stop the Fear, and we also had groups of human rights defenders part of these networks to protect journalists so that they could better work by providing them greater security with, for example, when covering migrant caravans or electoral processes. Article 19 then started leading this coordination for the network to ensure that media could have proper security. Anytime there are mobilizations, for example. So tomorrow, March 1st, this network will be activated, and it will remain active throughout the elections and even after that, because in 2018, we did this first, and then in 2021 again, with a significant election process, especially for the change in government in 2018, we have maintained this work. This network, Stop Fear, has the goal of ensuring free flow of information by preventing, monitoring, documenting, and reporting any aggressions or attacks on journalists or human rights defenders or election observers, to also verify any information in real time, because this could lead to people not voting. So we want to stop that, of course. In 2018, during the election process, there were 185 attacks recorded and 55 for the 2021 elections. This is a very concerning horizon because we see that there is growing aggression against the press while covering these processes. So our network from the beginning activates when the campaigns begin. That's why we will begin tomorrow, and we start monitoring any incidents before the election itself, if there's any type of aggression, and during the process, so that we can ensure through different strategies the safety. We have monitoring centers at every state with at least 10 federal entities in 10 states of the Republic to ensure these nodes remain active and help us implement protection and safety measures. And these actions take place when there is any possibility of an attack. We have integrated or holistic security and safety workshops, and to talk about physical security, digital security, legal and psychosocial safety, with an intersectoral approach and a gender approach, and also looking at the macro criminal context.
And by doing this, we develop security protocols so that every person, every journalist, every medium can have its own protocols, and we go to the various areas in the country to offer these workshops so as to help with and establish security and trust with journalists. We use WhatsApp so as to stay in contact with, to become a hub, so to speak, for journalists to report attacks, concerns, situations of risk that they might have identified. And also, this is a way for relevant information to be shared through infographics, through audio recordings where information is provided. And so that we provide tips also to cover protests and how to monitor different risk situations, and how to respond to situations such as arbitrary arrests, or if they witness or are the victim of an attack. And in order to be able to provide as much information about the rights that we have as journalists, and to be able to respond through this support network, this active support network, so that journalists go out into the field and they're not alone, and that these cases can be dealt with through this network, Stop the Fear, and be able to react to these situations of risk. It's not just about documenting things, it's also about having dialogues, discussions through webinars, with meetings with the authorities, to set up strategies ahead of time for those election periods, because most of the attacks that are seen are raids. People are physically attacked. There are blocks. Information is taken down, removed, disinformation campaigns, and there are threats. It's very important for this network to remain active. And also, on behalf of Article 19, I will provide you with the links for reference material about the tools that are available, since there are different types of materials available, manuals, protocols, guidelines for journalists to be able to consult and answer questions. And this has been an excellent exercise, actually, because there has been very good response in the face of a violent context in Mexico. Since in 2023, 5 journalists were murdered. In 2022, 16 journalists were murdered, and which is a very disheartening situation. But through these networks, we try to empower ourselves and strengthen ourselves, and be able to provide a system for support and for journalists not to self-censor and not abstain from certain types of coverage, or are not just silenced or self-censored. And so for Article 19, this is something that we would like to share with you. If you have any questions, I'm more than willing to entertain them. And please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Numi, and thank you for sharing those numbers and statistics from Mexico. It's incredibly worrying to hear that the situation is so bad for the journalists there. But thank you for sharing the amazing work that you at Article 19 and at Rompo El Miedo are doing to support journalists and to help them feel less alone, and to create those networks is so valuable. So we really appreciate you speaking to us today. And do please share those links in the chat. I think many people would be really interested in having those. Thank you all again for your presentations. We'll move on now to the Q&A section. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll move to those first. But for everyone else in the audience, do please feel free to share your questions. We'll try and get to them. We have quite a lot of time left to do that, so hopefully we can foster an interesting conversation for the last remaining half an hour. So I'll move now to the first question, which is an open question. Does anyone know an organization that could support a former journalist who is currently under threat, but now works for a government agency? She's being threatened for work she did while she was still a journalist. So this is quite a specific case, so I'll leave it to anyone who might know of any resources.
I can speak a little bit to that. So the IWMF is part of the Journalist in Distress Network, which is a group of organizations that support journalists who need emergency assistance. All of those organizations have different parameters about the type of support they can provide, but my understanding is that the parameters are primarily that the person must be a working journalist, or for example, if that person is no longer working as a journalist, it's as a result of something that happened to them during their work as a journalist. So I don't have a specific resource for them, but I would encourage them to just check out the website of the Journalists in Distress Network, which can provide more information about what all of our organizations collectively do support.
Thanks, Nadine. I'll also speak very quickly about our own support and that of the legal network of journalists at risk. They provide similar type of support to journalists in distress as well. And if it may be that it provides quite holistic support, so there may be someone within that could support this case. We would also require, first of all, there to be a legal issue, and then second of all, for them to be working as a journalist currently. But definitely have them reach out, and hopefully one of us could support. I'll move on to the second question, which is for Papa Ismaila. Hello, are there ways that your fellow journalists in Senegal can support each other, and do you have communities of support?
Oh, thank you. We do have a union here in Senegal, but it's much maligned, and it board has been out of office for last 2 years. Now they have to hold a general assembly to elect a new board, but they don't, a new board, sorry, but they don't do it. There's also a convention of Senegalese young journalists. They do a good job of training young journalists in Senegal, but recently they had been very criticized for awarding a thank you prize to President Macky Sall, despite all the attacks on the profession. We have also a women journalist organization, but which is very young. They're trying to reinforce and to protect women journalists here in Senegal. But the main problem for all these organizations is that they are very weakened by the laws, the texts we're having. There is a bigger organization with name in French, CAP in French, Coordination des Associations de Presse. So press association coordination, they're trying to protect journalists, but as I said, the main problem is like here we are very weakened by the laws which does not really protect journalists in Senegal. All we can do now when there is a problem is advocacy campaign on social media, in media. We say like international organization as Reporters Without Borders, and as some journalist networks, GIDN and others, to find some protection for journalists and try to make the government and the law to be respected.
Fantastic. Thank you for that answer. I don't think there are any more questions in the chat at the moment. So I think I'd like to ask you, in association with the answer that you just gave, if you could give some insight to whether or not there are still ways of communicating when there is a shutdown, and how journalists might communicate with one another or get vital information out. Is it possible at all? Are there methods of communicating digitally?
I don't understand really the question. Can you repeat, please?
Sorry. So when there are internet shutdowns in Senegal, is it still possible to communicate anything digitally? Are journalists, are there methods that journalists use to get information out, or is it really all encompassing?
Okay, when there's internet shutdown, the internet shutdown only concern the mobile data. So if you are on Wi-Fi, you can still be communicating with people. But the problem is 96% of Senegalese people using internet are using it on mobile data. So when, as a journalist, you are working, and even if you have Wi-Fi, you cannot talk only to 4% of people using internet in Senegal. The first internet shutdown, there was just some restrictions, and people were able to be back on internet by using VPNs. But right now, the 2 or 3 last ones, it was a total ban of mobile data. You don't have any mobile data. As myself, I was affected by that because I'm working on mobile data. I don't have Wi-Fi at home, so those days I had to move to my parents' house, and I was considered as a Wi-Fi refugee or as a digital refugee because I have to spend there 2 or 3 days to be able to work. Because as I'm living alone and I'm not really at home the whole day, so I do not have to have a Wi-Fi here for the few hours I have to spend here. So that's the problem, but people are trying to manage to work with Wi-Fi. We at AfricTivistes, we had some trainings on cybersecurity for journalists. We did it in 12 countries in Western Africa for around 600 journalists, and we trained them on how to work without internet, or how to work when internet is restricted, and how to use VPNs, for example, and the other tools, all other tools they can have to work when there's an internet ban. AfricTivistes is doing it. We are thinking of coming back on that program. It was our first program. We started on 2015, from 2015 to 2018. And now we're thinking of putting it back as a problem we have. We thought that internet ban was an old story, but Guinea has internet ban recently. Senegal is facing it, and we are sure that we're going to face it again in the next weeks or month. And some of the countries will face it on election day. So that's all we can do. Here right now, when there is an internet ban, it's only on mobile data. It's a total shut of mobile data. So you have to find somewhere a Wi-Fi to go in a place where there's Wi-Fi, or to go in a restaurant. For me, for example, to go to my parents' house where there is a Wi-Fi there.
Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting to hear, the personal consequences and how difficult it is for journalists to work in those contexts, because often we will hear the kind of overarching stories or the larger context in Senegal and the countries where it is happening. But I think it's so important to have those human stories as well. I have a question for Prasanth as well. I was wondering whether in India you have seen, you mentioned shutdowns, internet shutdowns, and you also mentioned spyware, which are 2 major threats. But I was wondering whether there's been a development of other types of tech that are being used to threaten journalists. I know that AI and deepfakes are something that you have worked in and that SFLC have been working on. And I was wondering if you could briefly touch on that. I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, with AI and deepfakes is a major problem that we are sure will face during the next election. So, especially when it comes to things like fact checking, that is again a major challenge. So that's I would say one major issue, even when it comes to the government machinery and the let's say the party in power. Mostly, there are a lot of misinformation which is being, let's say, sent on social media. And there are fact checkers who are trying to debunk this misinformation, and they are often getting backlashes, also both from the government or also from the right-wing elements. So that we have seen that happening. We had even a case where Zubair, who was a founder of I would say the leading fact check organization called All News in India was arrested over something that he had posted like years back and for which he had already got a protection from the court. So those things will definitely be a major challenge. And I mean, there are no real answers to this as to how you can really counter this. So this is the idea will be to, I mean, ensure that journalists get all support. I mean, mostly the legal support and also things like a digital security training for that matter. I mean, we have been talking about that, and we at our organization we have been conducting a lot of digital security training for various newsrooms, independent journalists, and that I think is also what we have been also telling them how. I mean, we have been including a module of let's say analyzing deep fakes and things like that, and how to figure out misinformation, how to do fact check. All these modules are also being added to ensure that these kind of new threats can also be countered. Thanks. And also to add on the internet shutdowns issue that was mentioned, that again is a major problem in India, and journalists have been at the receiving end at many cases. In India also, it's a total shutdown which happens. So even using VPNs don't work because it's the entire internet which is shut down. And often we have documented cases where journalists had to travel with, let's say, miles and miles to maybe in some cases move to the next state and then send across the reports from there. So yeah, it is a difficult work environment when internet shutdowns happen.
Thank you so much for that insight. All very important threats as well to know about and to consider moving forward and protecting journalists during the elections. We have a question from Jordan McInnes, which I think I will open up to the floor if anyone can respond to this one. For journalists in exile, what kinds of training or engagement do the panelists see as successful or potentially successful? And are there any specific ways in which INGOs can assist journalists today? I think there's a second part of that question, but I'll leave it for now because I think this is more specific to this area.
I can speak a little bit about that. This is a really difficult one, Jordan, that you're asking about, and we've seen the number of journalists who are in exile has risen dramatically, right? We've seen protracted conflicts around the world. Obviously, everyone will be familiar with the example of Afghanistan, when almost all of the journalists in that country were trying to leave after the US pulled out and the Taliban took over. And many of those journalists ended up in Pakistan. Many of them ended up in countries around the world, including the United States, where we ran a small pilot program with Afghan women journalists. And I think there have been a lot of lessons learned from that particular evacuation effort, one of which is that our organizations as media support organizations are really under-resourced and unequipped to deal with the scale of the problem at this point, because it's not just the sort of those conflicts. We're also seeing just an increase of journalists being displaced, from Latin America, from Africa, from all over the world. And it's very hard for those individuals to reestablish their lives in a new country where they may not know the language, where they're going through an asylum process perhaps, and where they really are in need of, sort of humanitarian assistance resources, which is not what our organizations as media support are necessarily set up to do. So with our little pilot project, for example, we had hoped to be able to help Afghan women journalists to reestablish their media careers in the United States through internships, through grants, and reporting opportunities. But what we learned is that first, we have to address the sort of immediate needs in front of them. So that's, the financial distress that many of them may be under, language. So they may need to learn English or whatever language of the new country that they've gone to. Support for trauma, which is something that often is really a big part of what needs to be addressed first. And so all those things mean that we need a more holistic approach and system, but also just, the financial resources to be able to support those journalists, because ultimately, the hope is that they could continue to be reporting in some capacity, even if they are doing so in exile. So we've seen some university models of fellowships, and I know that there are some other organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy that are doing work, and Freedom House around trying to support journalists in exile. So I point to those two as examples, but with the acknowledgement that this is a really enormous problem that we have not solved.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Is there anyone else who would like to speak on this topic? I think that was quite comprehensive, but perhaps there are other perspectives. If not,
Hola, yo quisiera.
Yes, I would like to. I would like to add to that. Of course, it is a very complex context, as Nadine has told us. The fact that these people have to be displaced and just living in exile, we are seeing this in all of Latin America as well, in Central and South America, people trying to reach the US, and we've found journalists among them as well. And some of these journalists have been attacked, they have been persecuted, they have legal processes against them in their home countries. And in Mexico, we try to protect them, protect their travel. There's also different networks in all of the Central America region. Our Article 19 is in contact with other networks to provide protection. However, under Article 19, we don't have a specific program for this, but we try to respond on a case-by-case basis to look at specific situations and create links and liaisons, because networks save lives. We always say this, and just maintaining that communication with different groups, organizations, and networks to provide protection has been a strategy that we have used, and it, of course, means we have to continue building these bridges, because just being able to protect them in such complex contexts is difficult. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rumi. It is incredibly important to build networks, and I think, as Nadine mentioned before as well, journalists, the Journalists in Distress Network and a few other networks are set up to try and provide this kind of holistic support. Media Defence is part of those as well, and although we have quite a limited mandate and support journalists under legal threats, we will also happily refer journalists who may be facing other threats simultaneously. As we all know, this is often the case, and holistic support is definitely something that our organizations need to focus on moving forward. Numi, I would also like to ask you another question quickly, if possible. I was wondering, you mentioned that there is a lot of self-censorship, of course, because of the threats of violence to journalists, and whether you have seen an increase in the self-censorship in the last few years, and especially with the elections coming up.
Yes. Again, the context in Mexico right now is leading to stigmatization of journalists working in any media that are not echoing any words by government. If there's any criticism, there's a stigmatization. The President of the Republic and the executive branch use the space that they have built up, the morning conference. They call it La Mañanera, the morning show in Mexico. They use this space to point out any journalists that are not on their side. They also lead to greater bias and stigmatization. They have even filtered information and doxed different journalists. And so there is the cascade effect that we have seen because of this. There are replications of this discourse and speech at a state and municipal level, and even citizens themselves are echoing these words through social media. So it's important to point out that there's differentiated violence for women journalists, so gendered violence. These types of smear campaigns and different threats they are seeing lead them to self-censor, and they are keeping quiet because they are afraid of any escalation in the aggressions and attacks and becoming more violent or more physical. In the context of organized crime, groups, there's areas like Chiapas and border areas where there's an increase in violence, and these areas are actually called areas of silence. We have no records of any violence or aggression in these areas. That does not mean they don't exist. It means that the press is not mentioning them because they don't want to expose themselves. And this is very concerning because more and more institutions are falling into these areas of silence. And one is just the stigmatization, the cascade effect, and there's direct threats from organized crime groups. And another scenario we're seeing now is that there is an abuse of restrictions and restricting standards. So for elections, gendered violence leads to legal processes being filed to censor women and to just threaten and try to scare off all journalists. And this trend is increasing in Mexico. There have been 22 legal proceedings filed against journalists in the administrative, civil, and electoral areas, and even criminal proceedings. This, of course, means that every month we have different processes. Every month it's about 1.83 legal proceedings being filed against journalists. This all combines with the different types of repression coming from all sides. And it's really that the press is being harassed and silenced with all these threats. Now that we are in the election process, there's even greater friction. There are more attacks trying to censor them. And we have recorded attacks on even pre-candidates. I mean, they're not even candidates to the election. They're just on the forerunners, and they are already attacking journalists. So this is all part of the context. I hope I answered your question.
You did, definitely. Thank you so much. We've also, of course, seen an increase in legal threats globally in relation to this, and especially in Mexico. So it's interesting to hear your specific context and the work that you're doing to support. We have two questions left from the chat. One is from Carlos Gallo. To the panelists focusing on legal threats specifically, is electoral law being used or abused by political parties or government officials to suppress critical reporting by framing journalism as electoral campaigning? Do you face different hurdles to help journalists in this context? Maybe this doesn't happen in your countries. Perhaps Prasanth, you could speak to that, or anyone else who feels like they may be able to contribute.
Yeah, I have not seen a specific incidents of journalists reporting being treated as campaigning in India till now. Yeah, I'm not sure how it's in other countries.
No problem. Is anyone else seen this threat specifically? If not, we can.
I have some internet connection problem. Can you repeat the question, please?
Of course. So the question is electoral law being used or abused by political parties or government officials to suppress critical reporting by framing journalism as electoral campaigning?
Yes, it can be. Like we had been like last time, television network has been cut off for some days. The government said they're cutting it off definitely because they do not respect the electoral laws, saying that they have they are threatening the national security or something, it can be used in Senegal. For example, in 2019 for the presidential election, there was a group of journalists. I was in that group who was trying to hold for the first time a presidential debate between candidates, and it's the National Media Authority who came and said our laws that allowed it, and said we have to like reform the laws to be able to do it. This was totally false. The laws said that we just have to treat equally the candidates. Having all the candidates in the same place to debate is the best way to have to treat them equally, I think. And that's the kind of things we have. The government is mainly using the National Media Authority, which is supposed to be independent from the government, but all the members are nominated by the president. The director is nominated by the president. It's a former journalist, but he's like his reputation is very known in the Senegal, in this country, for doing everything the government want, even when he was a journalist. So that's the main threat we're having on using the electoral laws. But the other laws they are using against journalists, it's like the penal laws, like threatening the national security, call to insurrection, such kind of things, or defamation sometimes we have, but not directly from the electoral law. It's mainly the media authority who is doing the job for the government.
Thank you so much, Professor Ismaila. I think I will ask one last question, very briefly, around intersectionality and threats to journalists. Are there any specific intersections? I know we've spoken about gender and briefly around race, but around religion as well, that you've seen with the intersection of religion and election reporting, and ways to protect journalists who might face this specific intersection.
Happy to speak.
Me gustaría contestar. Ay,
I
perdón.
would like to answer. Oh, sorry, Nadine. In Mexico, we have different types of intersectionalities, mainly with gender, towards women, people from the LGBTI community, and there's also a digital divide in terms of community radio. For indigenous communities, for example, indigenous communities don't necessarily have access to internet service sometimes, and there it makes for a more difficult environment for journalists to work, and also there's no way to convey the information sometimes in their native tongues and their native languages. In Mexico, we have Spanish, of course, but there are several local indigenous languages, and information is not provided to these communities in their language. This is another type of censorship for the press. They are not receiving information, or they only receive the information that could be called quote unquote official, where there's no criticism and there's no way to position yourself. So that is an intersectionality that leads to big disadvantages in terms of access to information. And also within the LGBTI community, there's attack, stigmatization against women journalists, and these types of situations lead to attacking their personal lives, their intimacy, and there's always specific aggressions on their body, on their personal life, and their family life. Thank you.
Thank you, Numi. Nadine, I know that you wanted to speak to us, but actually our final panelist, Kimi De Leon, was just able to join. I know she had difficulties joining before, so for the last 8 minutes or so, I would like to quickly hand over to her to speak. We will make sure that everyone has your contact details afterwards, so that if they have more questions about this topic, we can facilitate that later. I'll hand over now quickly to Kimi to speak. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I did have some issues with my internet connection, so thank you so much. I am here in Guatemala, and I'd like to share some of the challenges that regard to intersectionality. In Guatemala and all of Latin America, and I'm sure other parts of the world, we have different peoples living together and different nationalities within a country. We have several indigenous peoples in Guatemala, for example. We have Mayas, Garifunas, and Xinkas. This means that there are specific challenges and then also risks related to what it means to give your perspective, have your work as a journalist. Oh, give me just a second. To work in contexts such as election periods, or even considering the needs of indigenous peoples and citizens to live in a democracy. So the common dominating view does not include or respect community journalism or indigenous journalism or feminist journalism or women's journalism. There's also something we are seeing now, which is being a journalist with a dissenting view and with a different perspective. All types of journalists trying to give their opinion as part of the public opinion. And then we have the challenges of obstacles to the media, obstacles that don't let them share this perspective. Even if you are an organized political subject, in Guatemala, we see that there are great risks to indigenous and community journalists. They have been persecuted, they have been arrested, they suffer more attacks than journalists working in the cities, for example. Women journalists, as we heard from Noemi as well, receive misogynistic attacks, chauvinistic attacks, and this, of course, is not true for non-female journalists. And then other things that happen from anyone coming from a diverse perspective. Sometimes they are not recognized as journalists even. There's the first attack saying that they are not journalists, they're just activists sharing their views just because they're sharing a certain perspective or a different view based on their experience. So that was what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Kimi. We're really glad that you were able to join us. I'm sorry that you had internet connection issues. Thank you for providing that really important perspective, especially on Indigenous journalism and alternative journalism. These are things that are vital to recognize and are important for the discussion. Nadine, I believe we have a couple of minutes left. Would you like to provide final input before we sign off?
Sure. I just added some comments to the chat as well, just to build on Nomi's reflections, which I think are really spot on. But to say that we all bring, different layers of identity to this profession, and how people perceive us directly impacts the risk profile that we have. So someone who's showing up as a woman or as a non-binary journalist who is perhaps not of the dominant race, or who is not, who is a minority in their community, who is a minority in a religious community, is going to face potentially extra threats. And so newsrooms really should be providing extra support for those journalists to make sure they can work safely, and to be doing due diligence to really prepare them for their own safety. And again, allyship is so important. One thing I just want to come back to at the end here is that we are facing, I think, a really critical moment for global democracy, and the role of journalism in this moment is so paramount. And yet the resources and support to protect the journalists across the world who are bringing us this vital news, we don't have enough resources to be able to protect those journalists. So if there are any funders on this call, this is the moment. If you want to support democracy, you should be supporting journalism and local journalism, and you should be supporting the safety of journalists. To the newsroom leaders who are on this call, it's your responsibility to build a culture of safety so that your reporters can stay alive and thrive and be able to bring us the news that we all rely on in informed democracies. The co-panelists who we've heard from today are doing such important work in their communities, in their countries, and there are so many more who are working at the grassroots level to ensure that journalists can do their work. And I want to just thank them for fighting the good fight. And this is the year when we all need to be able to fight together. So thank you very much. Really appreciate this forum. And thank you, Anushka and Media Defense, for your collaboration.
Thank you so much, Nadine. I think that was a great way to end this panel and this discussion. And we also would like to thank everybody who has joined and who has spoken today. And again, yes, to all the journalists who are working so hard to bring us vital news, especially in this critical year for democracy. We have added all of the links to the organizations and to the initiatives and resources that the panelists have spoken about in the chat. So do make sure you follow those and give them your support in whichever way that you can, or even just to learn more about those. And that will be the end of our webinar for today. Thank you all so much for joining.